on doing this, to be honest with you. It started, I believe it started the week before Easter, and I just keep finding things in there that I just speak to my heart and want to share them with you. A lot of times, you remember this that if I point the finger at you, what do I always say? I have three coming right back at me. Okay, so often, a lot of times, I'll share things with you that have really been um, prominent in my life. Okay, does that make sense? Something that has really been a life lesson that I've learned, and this is one of those days. So let's read John chapter 5, verses 1 through 9. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which called in Hebrew is Bethsaida, having five porches. Where do you recognize that name? Hospital. Bethsaida Hospital in D.C. Mainly takes care of our military personnel and our veterans as well. In these lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had. Now a certain man was there who had an infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew he was already been in that condition for a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be made well?" And the sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I am coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Rise and take up your bed." Some translations say, "Take up your mat and walk." And immediately the man was made well and took up his bed and walked. And that day was the Sabbath. So here we have a fella sitting beside the pool, and every time the water is stirred up by an angel, the first person in the pool gets healed. Now, don't ask me about the theology of that, because I don't know. I've pondered that before. I don't know much about it, but common sense tells me that to be the first person in the water, you probably need to have some other ailment besides being lame. Okay? You have a bad arm? Yep, just watch the water and run and jump in at the right time. Even being deaf wouldn't be too bad. Just keep your eyes on the water, and when the water starts getting stirred, you can get in quickly. But being lame? And that's a different story. That's probably not going to happen. That's not the one ailment you wanted to have if you wanted to get into that pool quickly, if you were competing against other people to get into the pool. It's no wonder he had been there how long? 38 years. Now, where were you 38 years ago? How old were you 38 years ago? Can you remember? Yeah. Huh? Can you remember that far back? That's right. I began to think about it in May of 1981. That's how long that's been ago. I was finishing up my junior year in high school at Moco High. I've told you about Moco High before, haven't I? Mobile County High School. We called it Moco High. I had a 1966 Ford Mustang. It was beautiful. I miss that car. I had no girlfriend, though. President Reagan had just been elected to office and was beginning his first term. We had gotten a microwave oven at my house, and I thought we were just really high tech. Iran had just released the hostages. The space shuttle flew for the very first time. That was quite a year. Hard to believe it was 38 years ago. And so you can understand why I would say that 38 years is quite a long time to lay beside that pool just hoping to be the first one to get in and be healed. Now, personally, if I'd been him, I'd been laying on the very edge and just rolled over. For some reason, he didn't get the message on that. But it's a long time to be sitting there waiting to be healed. And that's the way it seems to be in life sometimes. Sometimes it feels like we just get shortchanged a little bit. Someone else gets the prize. Someone else gets in the pool before we have the opportunity to make it. I have a friend I had a friend in high school. Had, by the way, is the operative word. Had as in past tense. His name was Marcel. Anyone know someone named Marcel? Well, my friend's name still is Marcel. And him being a friend, kind of, we reconcile. But I started liking this little girl named Teresa. And I told Marcel about it, and he swooped in and started dating her. What was even dumber than that? Well, a few months later, I did it again. I started liking a cute little girl named Lisa. And I mentioned it to Marcel, and the next thing I know, they were dating. So had became the operative word, and strike two, and he was out, and I didn't trust him ever again in that realm. But sometimes that's just kind of the way I felt when I was growing up. I usually just barely missing the prize that someone else got. Always seeming to settle for second place or third place or no place at all. And as the old saying goes, I seemed to be a day late and a dollar short quite often. And so I'm sure this lame fella, and by the way, let's just name him Joe. That makes it easier. Instead of calling him lame fella, let's call him Joe. I'm sure Joe faithfully laid by that pool month after month, year after year, decade after decade, and I'm sure that there were many times when he thought life wasn't fair. You know, Jim and Bill over there, they've only been here a few months and they got in and they're healed. And then there's Sue over there. She'd only been here a few weeks and she ran and jumped in and she was healed. What about me, God? What about me? I don't know about you, but I've said that a few times in my life. Okay, God, why did you allow this to happen? What about me? When is my reward going to happen? When are the good things going to happen in my life? We don't know how often that angel came down and stirred the water, but let's just say it was an average of only twice a year. If it was just twice a year, then there were 76 people healed in front of old Joe. And I imagine most of them had been there a lot shorter of a time than he had been. And so Jesus comes along and he asks the silliest question that could be asked. Or was it silly? He asked the man, do you want to be made well? Do you want to be made well? This really wasn't a silly question, and we'll talk more about that later. But notice that the man never really answers the question. He never says, oh yeah, I want to be healed. He just kind of gives a litany of an excuse of why he had not been healed. But also notice that Jesus paid no attention to his reasoning, and he just goes ahead and heals the man anyway. I have a feeling Jesus knew. Yes, that was the desire of his heart. Now, there's only a couple things I want to mention here. I don't have 3 points today. I only have 2 quick points. I'm sure you're upset about that, right? Only a couple things I want to mention here. First of all, notice that Jesus tells the man to take up his mat and walk. Take up his bed, his mat, and walk. Why is Jesus so worried about that old stinky mat that had been there laying there for so long? Don't you know it stunk? That man had sweated on it. I mean, those summers in Israel are not exactly cool, okay? I imagine that old bed just stunk. They did not have Maytag washers and dryers back then. It just, it just stunk. And I'm not going to keep on talking about it, but why would Jesus be worried about that old mat that he'd been laying on for so long? Well, I think that mat is symbolic in that for 38 years, that mat had dominion over that man. That mat had dominion over that man. It was his identity. It was part of who he was. When someone saw Joe, they also saw this old bed that Joe was confined to lay on. It was a visible reminder, visible symbol of the life this man had been cursed to live for so long. And so in many ways, when you saw the bed, you saw the curse that this man had endured. Does that make sense? It was just part of his identity. It was a representative of his situation in life. And by taking up his mat, Jesus was telling him that he could have dominion over what once had dominion over him. He could own the mat instead of the mat owning him. I can see him in my mind's eye hurriedly rolling up that mat and putting it up under his arm. I would think I'd have found a trash can and thrown it in, but he rolled it up, put it up under his arm, and he was scooting out of there so he could go see his family and tell them he had been healed. The mat no longer carried him, but he was the one that was carrying the mat, and I bet very soon that mat went into the dumpster. I imagine that he was glad to see it go just because it made him remember the pain of those 38 years. I would ask you, is there anything that has dominion over you? For years I've seen one thing after another that had control over people's lives to the point it incapacitated them and they were spiritually lame. It might have been a habit such as alcohol or smoking or that owned the people. It could have been pornography, which is a big problem among the men of our country. I've seen people addicted to video games or television or a relationship that was just not healthy for that person. I've known people who were workaholics and spent all their free time in the office. And I've known people that were not workaholics and they couldn't hold down a job at all. Maybe it was a hobby or a passion in their life that had become an obsession. I had a good friend that was an avid golfer, and he was a good friend until it came to the point that he was spending every available moment on the golf course. There's nothing wrong with golf, is there? I like golf. I lived on a golf course for 4 years and never was very good at golfing, but I like golf. But he golfed to the extent to the point that he lost his family. He was always on that golf course. He lost his friends. I was one of them because we never saw him anymore. He lost his job because his boss could not depend on him to be at work on a beautiful sunshiny day. He would call in sick. It cost him everything, and golf became his lameness. I've mentioned several examples of lameness that all need healing, and if the truth be known, each one of us have a lameness in our life. Mine might not be yours, and yours is not mine, and we have different lamenesses, but we all have them in our lives. Maybe I've just mentioned a lameness that you struggle with, but just know that Jesus wants to bring healing, and He desires to set us free from our bondage. He wants to give us authority to carry our mat instead of our mat carrying us. But that brings us to the second thing I want to mention, and that is, you remember Jesus asked the man if he wanted to be healed, and that's still the question today. Do you really want to be healed? In my 21 years in the Air Force as a chaplain, I estimate, and I'm probably pretty close, I used to keep track of this, but I estimate that I did about 5,000 counseling sessions in those 21 years. A lot of counseling, especially early in my career. As a young captain, you do a lot of counseling. The reason is because the chaplain in the military is the only person that has complete confidentiality. And so when people would get in trouble, they're not going to go to the military psychologist, because that person could be called to testify against them. They're not going to go to their commander. They could get an Article 50. They could get paperwork. So they're going to go to the chaplain. Many young married couples who were struggling would come to me, and some of them were on the brink of divorce. Some of them eventually did end up in divorce court, and often it would be an obvious issue that could have been solved with just a few lifestyle changes. Maybe the young wife was involved in a wrong relationship with another man. Maybe the young husband was addicted to video games or pornography and was spending every waking moment at home behind a computer. Maybe finances were the issue and they couldn't quite get within the budget. because they were spending frivolously, and it was killing their marriage. Maybe it was alcohol, maybe it was whatever. But so many things I've seen, and all of these things I've seen many, many times. However, I would always ask the question to the one who had the problem, and that question was, do you want to change? Do you want to change? And I would usually see a hopeful and begging gaze in the eyes of the other spouse who was just praying that the answer would be, yes, I want to change. And often it was. But you would be shocked at how often the answer was, no, I don't want to change. Or, I'd like to change, but I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to change. No, I will not give up this habit, even if it costs me my marriage, my health, or my career. No, I will not change because my lameness means more to me than anything else in the world. My lameness is my identity. It's who I am, and without it, I have nothing. And to see the look of total rejection, and to see the eyes of the spouse filled with tears and watch them cascade down their face was sometimes a little bit too much for this old Air Force chaplain. Sometimes I would just cry right there with them. You see, we all have lameness of sorts, and Jesus comes to us and simply asks, do you want to be made well? And it's up to us to give an answer. And if that answer is yes, then Jesus can and will bring healing into our lives. But if the answer is no, then He will not force Himself upon us. He will respect our wishes. I've shared a little bit of my life story, my life trauma with you, but I'll share this with you. Years ago, after going through the trauma of a divorce, I found myself constantly bitter and angry. My blood pressure was high. I was always on edge. And then I met Jean, and one of the first things she shared with me, and we were 1,500 miles apart, one of the first things that she shared with me was how important kindness was to her. And at that moment, kindness became important to me, because I wanted to win her heart, and I knew that I would have to speak her love language, and that love language was kindness. Kindness. And so I began to pray and pray for God to take away my anger, my bitterness, and turn it into love and kindness. And slowly over the next few months that began to happen. Not that I always hit the mark, but my life is different now than it was then, because Jesus came to me and asked if I wanted to be made well, and I simply said yes. Today I ask you, is there anything in your life that needs to be healed or fixed or removed or changed? Maybe today you've seen something within yourself that just bothers you, and you know that this is your lameness. Maybe you've been dealing with it for many years, maybe even decades, and you've all but given up. You've just said, well, this is who I am. I have good news for you, and that is the Messiah is coming your way, and He simply asks you the question, do you want to be made well? And I encourage you to simply say yes and reach for His hand and allow Him to raise you up. And just as Joe took authority over his life by picking up the symbol of his lameness, Jesus will give you the dominion over that which has hurt you and has controlled you. And the question for you and me is, do we want to be healed? And do we want to be healed enough to trust Jesus to do the healing? My prayer is that your answer, my answer, will be yes to these questions. Jesus has come our way today. He's standing right here offering to heal us. What will we say? Let's pray together. Lord, we thank you for this story of Joe and how you brought healing into his life, something he had wanted for so long. And maybe, just maybe, there's someone here today that's been wanting that same healing. Maybe not for lameness of the body, but maybe an issue within their lives that's brought such sorrow and such hurt to them and maybe even to other people. Oh God, we reach up for your hand today. And Lord, if there's any of my friends here that's struggling with lameness, I pray that they know that you offer them healing. That you're reaching down to them and saying, do you want to be well? Do you want to be healed? Lord, help us to say yes today. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.